Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 2, The Courtyard.
Here we are.
Hunnick pressed a finger on a neatly outlined island, roughly halfway between the coast of Arran and the southern border of the inland sea.
This you will not see on the sea charts of Nuria.
He smiled wryly.
And here is something else you will not see on the maps of the mind-crippled captains of the north.
A boy, fair and bright-eyed, frowned up at him.
You despise them?
It was more a statement than a question.
Don't you?
Hunnick paused with his finger in mid-air, meeting the sea-blue, somewhat disconcerting gaze of the child. A memory stirred in his mind of the exhausted form crawling from the witch sea onto Ura, the sudden panic that had gripped his heart when Beor had launched his arrow at it, the wonder and relief when the arrow had missed. The boy shrugged and turned back to the map.
I did.
He leaned his elbow on the table and rested his chin on his fist, adding as an afterthought,
I do feel pity for them.
Perhaps.
Hunnick swept a hand over the southern regions of the map before them.
If they but knew what lies in store.
He pressed his finger on what seemed to be the symbol of an altar in the central parts of the heavily forested southland.
Here is the stronghold of the Amul.
The Amul, the Red Skull. I saw him in the fields of Arran. You know, the assassin.
Hunnick paused to gather his thoughts.
The dream, you mean? The warning?
He nodded slowly.
So you have seen a bit of the jungle, and the ones who live there, in your own way.
He smiled.
And you know that they are ruthless and dangerous, if not so well trained in the art of war, or equipped with all our finery. Malik rules them as a god-king, and has built an empire in the jungles, with thousands and thousands of warriors who will readily shed their blood for him.
He traced a line along the coast.
The older tribes of the Reithu have all been subjected and enslaved.
He touched the spike of land reaching up to Arran.
The Giri Confederation has allied themselves with their all-powerful neighbor, paying tribute, supplying more men and, most importantly, hundreds of boats.
And this?
The boy pointed to a strange symbol in the far west of the jungle. Hunnick grimaced.
And yes, that's how you pronounce it. It takes some practice, and you have to be careful not to swallow your tongue on the last half of it. They are the people of the teeth, impossibly savage, fierce, and difficult to locate. You do not want any dealings with them. The Gudrid Empire, that's Amul and its subjects, has pushed them into the west, and there they sit, hiding in the thickets, gnawing on the bones of any foe they can capture.
Gnawing on the bones?
Hunnick smiled broadly.
Cannibalism's a big thing in the south, Gareth. But not the worst thing by far.
Gareth shuddered.
Not the worst?
No.
Hunnick's smile faded.
There are worse things to do to a man than to destroy his body.
He looked at the boy in alarm.
You know about this.
A shadow had fallen between them. For Gareth, the grey-cast day lost what little warmth it had. Welling up unbidden from his memory came the skeletal shape of a tall tree on a far-off Belruth hillside. Clearly, inescapably, the scene presented itself. The careful placing of the body, the ritual that had been carried out here, and with it came understanding. Malik the Undying. He it is that fears you, fears the gifts you carry, desires to end you, and steal what he can of the power that resides in you. The ritual murder had been planned for him. That tree would have been his prison. Only he had escaped it by some miracle. Yet the relief was poisoned by the horrendous realization that he had condemned his friend to that fate with a simple act of charity. The smallest detail did not escape him now, even as his natural vision blurred and he dropped his face into his hands. Gareth was still enshrouded with misery that afternoon when he entered the austere quarters of the Master of Heron Inrath. Garth drew the reason for his distress from the unwilling boy by assuring him that he could not even attempt mastering the art while his heart was laboring with other burdens.
I killed him, even if I did not intend for it to happen.
Gareth's eyes begged for a contradiction.
Don't be silly. There is no way you could have known you had put him in harm's way. Your act was one of kindness, and not self-preservation. It was the stupidity and carelessness of the assassins that killed him in your place. They ought to have seen that he was not even a true-born Viron. Just put that nonsense out of your mind.
Gareth dropped his gaze. The reassurance from Karth brought little comfort. The latter sensed it and put a hand on the boy's shoulder.
Perhaps you think that he suffered badly when they killed him like that. You believe Malik hurt him to take what he actually wanted from you. But what could he have stolen from Riot? If he had consumed that boy with his imperfections, he could have done himself much harm.
Karth stopped. His fresh attempt had not met with success. The small body beneath his hand was shaking with sobs. Sighing deeply, he searched for something to say. The miserable episode of Riot's demise seemed irrevocably tragic. He made another attempt.
Riot received the burning of a prince of Nuria. The king and the high counselors mourned him. His ashes were buried among the great rulers of his nation, despite the fact that they had cast him out in life. He was honored in death, an honor he would never have been accorded as a shepherd's son. In a way, he was spared a difficult and troubled life as an outcast. His death was a small atonement and a homecoming.
His thoughts were drifting off, finding their way to the great courtyard of the Belruth Citadel, where the flames received the mortal remains of another royal so soon after the burning of the queen. He was unaware of speaking his thoughts aloud.
It is fitting that he followed his mother into the flames, and that he was mourned as the younger prince of Nuria.
There was a gasp from the boy, a shocked, accusing stare.
You think it also?
Gareth no longer doubted the terrible suspicion that had taken hold of him in Aethera's room. The torn hanging, Riot's precious little glass bead. And there had been the uproar when his association with the boy had been discovered. And here was Karth's guilty look now that the truth had slipped from him in an unguarded moment. Was he even her son? But she would not have lied in her letter. His voice was strange and distant.
He was the son of my mother. Riot was my brother. But how did he turn out like that? He had a different father. He must have had.
Karth placed a hand over his mouth.
Leave it be, Gareth. Let your mother take the secret with her. If she had wanted you to know, she would have told you.
Gareth spent the next day in solemn contemplation. Karth had no time to see him, and Hunnick was occupied at the harbor. The boy trudged up and down the beach with his guard in tow, absent-mindedly poking at broken shells in the surf, or tossing small stones into the waves. By the evening, he had decided to let the matter rest. Nothing would change the fact that Riot was gone, unloved and unappreciated in life except by him. His strange mother had added another mystery to her life, and the turmoil of her passing had offered no clear explanation to her surviving son. Had she not mentioned that they had been forced to part at his birth? Why would that have been the case? He had been returned to her, perchance at the time of Riot's birth, when this second son had been cast out, still carrying the mark of her betrayal in his body. But surely she would have known in advance if she had taken another man after Fengor. She could not have known. But how was that possible? All the questions wore him out till he declared a one-sided ceasefire. There had been a dream on the inland sea, promising certainty and clarity. He had seen a man in the courtyard at night, a strong suggestion of truth among all the riddles. Gareth knew that he would not leave the Witch Isle without having his answer, however incredible. The dreams had not been wrong thus far. The morning was grey and gloomy, with a not-so-distant threat of violence. The rhyme-song storms had arrived, their regular passage accompanied by gales and driving rain. Tall, smoky columns crowded in from the east, like a forest of floating down, its tangling roots of light tearing up the sky. Already the first forays were tugging at the open shutters, causing the lamp to flare. Garth closed the book with a snap, giving the boy a guilty start.
You have not heard a word I said.
I am sorry.
Your thoughts are still in Belruth.
There was a slight shake of the head.
No.
Then what troubles you?
The boy's eyes fixed themselves on the old man.
Questions. Lacking answers.
Garth could not prevent a smile.
And you think I can provide these answers?
He folded his arms and stretched out his legs.
Ask away.
You told me about a prediction.
Oh. You mean Or's Lament?
Yes. You said there was hope in it, and it had to do with Malik and me.
Garth did not reply immediately. He looked at the eager young face across the table, the wide eyes expectant yet afraid. He rose from the table and crossed over to the window to close the shutters. Outside, the wind had risen, stirring the ocean into wild exuberance. Already it keened about the stones of fir like so many ghosts, still calling for unattainable restitution. Tonight, he would hear the old familiar voices once more.
Let us sit by the fire.
Gareth rose, suddenly aware of the changed mood. Quietly, he seated himself on the hearthrug and drew up his knees. Garth drew a heavy curtain to shut out partially the sounds of the approaching storm. When he sat down, his eyes were already fixed on places and people of the distant past.
Or's Lament. You wish to hear it? It is a sad affair, always leaving you with despair and sorrow as companions. I remember only fragments of it clearly, and of course the music is long lost, though I still hear echoes in the song of a bird or the wailing of the tempest through the ruined stones. It was drenched in magic. How it dragged one into its embrace, like an overpowering perfume, a potent wine.
He smiled.
Listen to me. Just the thought of it would transform me into a poet.
A peal of thunder followed these words, at which Gareth looked up sharply, but the old man did not seem to notice.
It was a lengthy piece, but no one thought of moving throughout its first and only sounding. Unknowingly, we all realized it was important, and much of it did suit our time, for the Viron had grown weak and complacent, though I had no idea how far they still had to fall. The lords who heard it then are long gone. I alone remain. If it was a prediction, and it is no longer remembered or taught anywhere, then it was meant for me.
He paused and smiled oddly.
And mayhap for you, who will hear it now.
A shiver of anticipation passed up Gareth's spine. The gale moaned through the empty passage outside Garth's quarters. As if accompanied by the ferocity of the elements, the old man leaned forward, speaking in a loud sing-song tone, his gaze fierce and compelling. Soon the scene drifted into view, the old minstrel, his eyes ablaze with inspiration. The lords looked on, frowning. Their servants stood transfixed, fearful, wine flagons forgotten. The flames seemed to stream from the braziers, as if stirred by the tempestuous air swirling around Aaron Inrath. And there, rising above Kael's dull echo, came the enthralling tune, conjured from the aging voice of a master and a single harp.
Sing high on the Viron shore, a tune of true knowing, a song of secrets. Death is marching forth. Raise high the banners for war, sound the copper trumpets, ring the bells of brass, throughout the sleeping north. Who will stand for you now that your strength is lost? Of all the heroes fallen silent, who remains to count the cost? Where is your liege lord, the king of your faithless plight, to undo the pale disguise and pierce the rising dismal night? Soon you know by rote the pleading form of right,
enemies unseen among you smiling at your stolen sight. Your tables groan with plenty, a toast to silvered sin. Lift up your amber cups to celebrate the dark within. Weep loudly for the faded faith. Weep for the world that was. Say a prayer for the empty hearth to gods long forgotten. Heaven hears you not, cares not for your fate. Cower in your holes, embrace your fallen state. Wipe them not away, the bitter tears of rhyme, summoned forth from spite, the jewels of your time. You have turned the first wild honey into weeping dew, and made the champions of your race into an exiled few. Sing sorrow on the Viron shore, a song of true knowing, a song of failing light. Bring a lament for the Viron land, troubled and betrayed, to sink in endless night.
Gareth fought his way free of the enchantment. Garth's voice had faded some time before. The lords had risen to their feet. Many heads were bowed, and here and there was the glint of tears. The herald of their doom was weeping also, though his voice remained clear and unaffected. Something changed. Gareth felt the tightening round his temples. There was a silent stir among the lords, as if they had all drawn in their breath at the same moment. A girl, somewhere out of sight, screamed in fright and was hushed. The minstrel had faltered, stooping, but now he straightened up and his grip closed once more round the ancient ark. Gareth smiled painfully to himself. He knew what was coming. Or's lament was about to be extended beyond the ark of the poet. Somewhere, hiding behind a cloak of flesh and blood, the seer stood among them. The old man's voice gained a new quality. His eyes grew wide with wonder as the flow of words escaped him, while his fingers moved with the vigor and deftness of his youth. He turned his gaze on one of the lords, a man in his prime, bearded and proud. Gareth recognized him at once, Cale. There was authority now. The frame of the singer trembled with it.
Thrust the bright beam twixt clouds of rolling dark, turn the dread slumber, define the quick spark that sleeps in exiled souls of mighty sons of Vir. Receive the frozen heart in the season of your fear.
Someone else was screaming now. It was increasingly difficult to make out the minstrel's words, for a great rushing of water had risen from somewhere. Gareth was assailed with the insane thought that it was the sound of his own blood. Giddiness rose up in him. He had to escape this dream.
The blood of fathers brought to boldness in their unwilling son. Blood is solace, blood is curse, till by blood his heart is won.
He did not want to hear any more, see any more. There were fingers pointing at him, a crowding in of priests and tutors, the hateful sound of Fengor's betrayal, and then a blade to pierce his soul, a cold, cold whisper in the dark.
The light, Hegrak. We have a listener.
He was slipping away from the crowded hall. A last distorted verse tumbled after him.
Hide him from the hooded man, a baneful child, in whose unnamed birth the ancient lines are reconciled.
Gareth could not move his head. There was pain, but not as much as he had expected. He opened his eyes. The rim of a cup swam into view. He drank the bitter draught without protest. The fog cleared a little. He realized Karth had placed a hand behind his neck, accounting for his immobility. He was still seated on the hearthrug. Darkness had descended on the room, and the din of a mighty rainstorm drowned out even the close crackling of the fire. Garth wore a frown of concern, but his voice betrayed amusement when he spoke.
You asked me about the portent, and then rush off to take a look for yourself. I am not trusted sufficiently for a true account, perhaps?
Gareth gave him a wan smile.
I am afraid that I cannot control these things as well as you can.
No matter. At least I need not convince you what was said. But perhaps you have tasted a little of the magic?
He slipped the half-empty cup into the boy's hands and retreated to his chair. For a few moments there was no sound of the lashing rain outside.
You think it was me? The child he mentioned?
Was it?
It could have been Riot, and there was no one to hide him.
Perhaps, but I think otherwise.
Is that why you are hiding me here?
That is just part of it. The part that concerns you directly. There is more to it, much more. Other avenues I have tried to explore. I certainly have had enough time to ponder over it. He turned away to stare into the flames. There were warnings about the southern forests, beyond the marshes of Terrallen, places I have never seen, where Malik guards secrets I have never been able to probe. Until now, he faced the boy again. The wind gusted round the walls outside, rattling the shutters. The exiled Rune Seth Albarad is peeping through the horror's window. Gareth overslept the next morning. No one had come to wake him, for there were no lessons to attend, and the gale had not abated. He was glad of it, since the dream in Karth's room the evening before had left him exhausted. Hunnick was nowhere to be found, and Gareth suspected that he would be left to his own devices for the day. With the weather showing no sign of improving, this meant that he would retire to his room and attack the heavy volume Karth had lent him. He had thus far neglected to make a start on it. The great deeds and most fearful adventures of Fenwith Seth Call, Blade Lord of Gilreth, creaked open in his hands. He touched the yellow pages with reverence, breathed in the odd aroma of 2,000 cycles before. He traced the contours of the writing with his finger, smiling at the strange sensation of touching something so ancient, so precious. He turned the first page. The golden lamplight touched upon a single word: Initiate. The story of Fenwith would commence the Viron way, with a trial, a touching of the stone, and a dream of purpose. It was only after the evening meal that Karth sent for him. There would be no time for a lesson this day, but he was glad nonetheless. There were more questions burning in his mind. He could not wait to be told why the old man had summoned him so late in the day, but launched the first one moments after entering the room.
What exactly is the course?
The course of the initiate. Karth seemed tired and a little distracted.
Yes. What is it supposed to mean? You say I have run it, yet I don't feel that I have.
Sit down. Karth pointed to Gareth's usual place on the rug. He waited till the impatient boy was thoroughly installed before answering. The actual course was a trial for boys your age, composed of a series of challenges, both mental and physical. It was run round the Tower Lake and in the mountains, and ended when the initiate discovered and touched the stone. Thus awakened, he would return to Viron to pursue whatever he had seen.
There is another stone in the towers?
No. The stone in Belruth was taken from the mountain after the cleansing started in Viron to become part of the new ritual. Gareth looked at him in puzzlement.
But how could I have touched it when I never ran the course?
You may have run part of the course before you ever touched that forbidden stone. What you have done since is the result of that touch. You must understand that your vision can only direct. There are many events and encounters that shape the raw qualities of your soul. Such experiences will reveal your purpose, if you survive them. You have proven yourself true in aiding your friends. He stopped at Gareth's distant, preoccupied look. Are you listening to me? The boy frowned up at him.
It's really my friends who have aided me.
And Riot? A flash of pain passed over the boy's face. His reply was barely audible.
In the end, I could not aid him at all.
Karth persisted. Lur and the merchants meet? Evrail and Mirail and Keel?
Evrain? But that was...
An encounter revealing much about who you are. Certain choices were made. You could have saved yourself in the inn, left Evrain to his own devices, but you chose not to.
There was another boy in Belruth who touched the stone. They killed him for it. Had he run the course also?
It would profit you nothing merely to touch the stone of fear. It has to be done when you are beckoned. And I know that he has ceased his beckoning since before the doom.
He stared at the boy.
To touch the stone without invitation would show you nothing. Only those who would run the course successfully would ever be called to the stone.
For a fleeting moment, Gareth felt the compelling lure he had experienced in the passage off the temple. He wondered if that was what the old man meant with being called. It had to be, since he had seen so many things, and somehow he had been different, though in what way it was hard to tell.
But why was I called? He said he had forgotten us who had forgotten him.
You could not be ignored. The legacy you have inherited in line of birth, as well as your quality of spirit, is a bright beacon in the dark. You're certainly knocked persistently, and for a long time, even if unknowingly, before he let you in.
You mean he knew about me?
He was aware of you in some way, but chance only in that he felt someone was still alive in that graveyard that Belruth has become.
And now? What am I supposed to do?
You don't know? Didn't he show you?
It was confusing. Pictures and pain and feelings, like a bad dream, only you can't forget it.
His eyes flared wide.
Mostly, I was just afraid.
He shifted uncomfortably.
Something strange happened when I touched it, like a dream, but it was real.
It seemed real.
No, it was. I felt the sand between my fingers, the wind.
Garth leaned forward, frowning.
I told you, you ran the course. Though the vision is supposed to come at the end.
He lowered his voice.
Part of what you saw, was it accompanied by an overpowering desire?
Gareth allowed the disconcerting memories to escape their prison. Fearful images moved before his mind's eye, the last of which almost made him gasp.
Yes. Towards the end of what he showed me, I know there is something I have to do, want to do.
He touched you, there, in what you desired, in what you were meant to express.
He smiled at the boy's heavy frown.
It sounds like a complicated thing, but when it unfolds it will be simple and natural for you to do.
Does the vision ever change? What if you miss it?
I do not know. I have missed things, and it is beyond sad when you do. It must be something like death without a purpose. I live now to make up for those chances I have missed.
Gareth took up the poker and stirred around in the embers with it. He tried to digest what Garth had told him, but several things remained out of place in his thoughts.
My course seems so different to the way it used to be. In the book you gave me.
He shrugged. Garth smiled at him.
You are thinking like a priest. The course is not a ritual. It has to be followed in an exact pattern, or the gods will be displeased. It was designed to awaken the potentials within the subject. That is why one took no food for a 10-day. The initiate, summoned at such a young age, gained insight and awareness early enough to be of great value to his people. When the initiate was stripped of fear and clumsy fleshly needs, he could touch truth and be touched by it in turn. It is quite possible to be stirred sufficiently on the field of battle or in front of the heating forge or anvil. However, such an awakening could come early or late in life. Boys your age were given an opportunity to find their purpose, but not all of them did. Some were overcome by the hardships they had to face, or the fear and awe of approaching the stone, but not you. You overcame the threats of the priests, the penalties of Nurian law, the barriers of ritual and ignorance, and were rewarded with your vision.
The boy had stopped his stirring and appeared to be listening intently, yet his expression remained a frown of disbelief. Garth sighed.
You need more evidence? The fear of the portal veil is enough to break the nerve of strong men. Yet you are unperturbed, if a little confused. To enter the veil, ordinary men need a guide, a seer to bring them in and lead them out. You stumble in, not even using a gateway.
But I didn't mean to. It was by accident.
Garth smiled.
True power resides in the discovery of what you really are, and not the vain imagining of what you think you are. You will never grasp with your little understanding the machinations of the art, yet you can wield the Viron blade by a different kind of knowledge.
the understanding of the soul. That is to what awareness the course brought the initiate. Still, once awakened, the potential had to be realized, developed, by experience, much like the polishing of the stone, to bring forth the quality of its heart.
Then I'm still on the course.
Gareth replaced the poker in its stand and rose to his feet. Garth nodded. In a way, I am too, though I was never an initiate. All the encounters of your life are meant to refine you, shape you for your purpose. Even those you deem to be failures. He lowered his eyes. Especially those. Anik told him the next morning why he had been summoned in the first place. Garth would not be able to see him for 3 days, and believed it would be a good investment of his time to continue his training in basic swordplay and archery with Anik. The latter laughed at the boy's apparent displeasure, and assured him that he did not have the time or inclination to subject him to the rigors he had no doubt had been used to in Belgruth. At this, Gareth returned his wide smile. He could not wait to see the Viran's face when he saw a fully composed blade in the hands of a young trainee. The harbor lights of Fur reached across the calm bay in long amber streaks. It was a most welcome sight after the rough weather that had hampered their return journey to Heron Inrath. Rune stared at the winking lights with mixed feelings. The Witch Isle and its master remained as enigmatic as ever to him, making it impossible to think of the island as his home. The goods and trappings of his former life had remained behind in Curtain. They were few enough in number, the chattels that made the inside of a structure into a place of familiarity and comfort. Though there was little value among them, and he certainly did not miss anything, here in Fur he did not even possess the covers on his temporary bed. Where was this whole adventure leading him but to an ignominious death in some foreign field? And now there was that monster in Malik's forest, a creature of fantastic imagining. Here, so far from the dark Southland shore, he had to keep convincing himself that he had actually seen it, been close enough almost to touch it. Only Millen's fearful silence about the whole incident assured him of its reality. The youth's nerve was still shattered to such a degree that he had become sullen and unresponsive, performing his tasks with furtive looks and clumsy disinterest. Only Rune's knowledge of what had caused the state kept him from despising his companion utterly. One urgent question was foremost in his thoughts. Had Garth known about this creature? Had he sent them to that forsaken stretch of forest to be confronted by it? The game had taken an unexpected turn. Perhaps the old man regretted his bargain now. Mayhap he could not deliver what he had promised. Now he would rid himself of the mercenary Nurian he had so rashly acquired. Or had the whole episode merely been meant to intimidate his overbearing ally? Could it be that Rune was simply to see that he was not as clever, as powerful and able as he believed? But if Malik commanded that creature, what hope could Garth and his mottled Southland refugees have of ultimate victory? More than ever before, he was certain that he had joined with a madman in a fool's enterprise. Rune shelved all the fruitless contemplations as their ship approached the quay. He would report his arrival to Lord Garth before retiring to bed. Tomorrow there will be enough opportunity for recrimination. Perhaps there would be an appropriate explanation for the encounter, perhaps not. Of one thing he was certain: their ways would have to part soon, or he would surely be confronted with similar situations in the future. The harbor was deserted. Ships at anchor here had been moved to the sheltered side of the island, and were still there, though the gale had blown itself out.
Not a soul stirred among the warehouses or on the dimly lit walkways. The smallish ship that had picked them up at their appointed rendezvous at the Fever Coast slipped up to the wooden quayside in silence. A solitary figure with a lantern waited to catch the rope. The gangplank was lowered, and Rune strode onto it, his tall shadow leaping across ahead of him. A night fog was creeping in from the sea, drawing halos round the ship's lanterns. It was cold. The streaming breath of the men bringing ashore the few items of cargo hung in the air. The wind had died down to a gentle stirring. There could be frost towards the morning. Having stored the cargo in a warehouse close by, the sailors and their captain clattered up the walkway to their welcome suppers. It was late, but a cook would be standing by for them. Bringing up the rear, Rune paused in mid-stride. An odd sensation had stolen over him. He glanced round at the deserted quay. He was suddenly uneasy, as if he had neglected to perform an important duty, or forgotten to keep an essential appointment. His eyes roamed over the foggy banks rolling in, the twin masts of the vessel at the dock, the stars in the hard sky overhead. Where was the source of this nagging thought? The footsteps of the men faded behind him. The seawater lapped at the wooden supports of the silent quay, gaining an odd half-echo in the fog. He gripped the hilt of his blade, waiting. He imagined a whisper from the dark, not a challenge, not a greeting, but a simple, toneless word. A name? He shrugged and turned to follow the others. The Witch Isle. It was an appropriate name for the place. Every time he returned to it, there were more strangers from the south with their strange gods. The very smell of them was wild and tainted with alien appetites and urges. Now they flocked all over the island, observing their rites and dancing about the fires with disturbing displays of ritual abandon. No wonder one felt the presence of strange spirits lurking just beyond the reach of the senses. Something of the strangeness lingered during supper, a word, a phrase, or a sudden burst of laughter sounding hollow and out of place, as if the rest of the conversation had passed him by unnoticed. Was it perhaps that the old man was up to one of his tricks again? Could he not leave his latest victim in peace? Rune gulped down the excellent wine without his normal appreciation. It was better to go and see Karth straight away. Perchance he could shake off the feeling then. Outside, the night waited in silent anticipation. Something important was about to unfold. Millen was at his elbow, but he sent him back inside. The report would be made in the morning, so the witness was not needed as yet. The fog swirled about him as he walked. His footsteps resounded oddly in the passages, bouncing back at him from the stone walls. An archway loomed ahead. A whisper, breathless and disembodied, sounded in his ear.
Show me your love.
Rune started violently, pressing his back against the wall. He shuddered as something brushed against his cheek. The night was filled with the scent of sun-tied grass and dried flowers. His own voice was barely audible. "Witch, will you want me forever?" He was breathing hard, his hand shaking on the rough stone. "Leave me in peace!" The phantoms faded back into the night. He straightened himself and glanced about him angrily. If anyone had witnessed this spectacle, curse the Lord of Heron Inrath and his art. It was nigh impossible to keep control of one's senses once within his domain. But Rune would not be intimidated, not again. He strode through the archway with clenched teeth. Pillars of stone, topped by a walkway, lined the edge of the yard to his left. A large lamp had been left to burn here through the night, casting its glow over the flagstones, glistening here and there with the damp of the swirling fog. He was halfway across the yard before he noticed the figure. Standing in plain view, bathed in the glow of the lamp, stood a young boy. The hood of his doublet was down, and his fair hair damp, as if he had waited here for some time. despite the tension and apprehension of earlier, Rune perceived no threat and did not even pause in his stride. Their eyes met. A half-formed question about the boy's presence here at such an hour disappeared from his mind. For a shocking instant, he felt Aethera's gaze upon him, her alluring youthful enthusiasm that had so captivated him before. Yet there was more. Inexplicably, he was Nurian again. Yes, undeniably so, as if all the cycles of bitterness, the cruel exile, the wrongs of Fengor and his pet council no longer mattered. His body moved on unsteadily, someone else marching on this futile route set out for him. He passed on with it, unwillingly, through the gaping doorway. His bewilderment did not abate as he approached Karth's quarters. Even when the guard refused him entrance, informing him that his master had retired early and could not be disturbed, he merely nodded dumbly and headed off towards his room. Half of him wanted to return to the courtyard. Had it been another phantom dished up by the strange night, he was convinced it had been real. There was no one lingering there. The boy had stood close to the doorway, his hand on one of the columns. Rune reached out to touch the worked stone, as if to receive reassurance that he had not deceived himself. His fingers played over the graceful depiction of a swan, etched deeply in the stone. Gareth slipped past the sleeping guard and bolted his door from the inside. The wild drumming of his heart still sounded in his ears. Quickly he undressed and slid into bed, not daring to explore the multitude of suggestions swirling around in his mind. The night was far spent, and if he were to find sleep at all, it was best to leave the speculations till daylight. He pressed the pillow over his eyes and waited for the erratic beating to slow down. Not since the terrific encounter with Vir in the Belruth Temple had he been so out of sorts. He laughed suddenly, silently, but at the same time felt the tears rising from his chest, where a tightness made it difficult to breathe. It was no use. He sat up, pressing his back against the cold wall and bringing up his knees. The vision in Evrain's boat was accurate. The man had stepped into it just when he was supposed to. He had not been as tall as Gareth had surmised, but everything else was in place. The look had been unmistakable, the moment of shock, of impossible recognition. Now he would have to believe the rest of it, even if there was no more proof to be had than a wordless impression in a dream. Who was this Viron man, with his familiar looks and the obvious ill use that had become his way of life? He was a threat to all within his reach, a man of shattered loyalties and no vision. Surely he could not have run the course. Gareth smiled to himself. Of course not. But for the intervention of stubborn fate, there was no longer any course for the Viron to run. Was he an outcast also, bereft of land and family? Yet he had about him still the look and bearing of a lord, a man of authority whose fiery gaze threw out a challenge to anyone who would dare cross him. Something about this appealed to the boy. Had he not imagined himself with the same bearing, the same look, when he had been forced to flee Nuria like a frightened little pup? That was how he would have returned, powerful and sure of himself, to confront the murdering priests and their rotten king. The thrill of seeing such a man made him shiver. Oh, in the morning he would find out who it was, and then everything would change, and all the long-hoarded hopes be fulfilled. He drew the pillow into a tight embrace and turned on his side. It was good to be alive. Shortly before sunrise, he was woken by the change of the guard outside his door. From the muffled shouting, he imagined that the poor fellow had been caught sleeping on duty. He did not envy the man sitting outside a door all night in the cold, not while there were such things as thick woolen blankets and pallets of feathery softness to keep one warm. He floated back to sleep. Aethera's words were stilted and detached, as if she had rehearsed them many times. She gazed at him as if he was not there, her dead eyes impassive.
Questor Talon is a dangerous man, my son. Beware of him. He knows about your past. He bears your ill will.
Gareth thrashed about to escape the sea of familiar equivocation. The ache of elusive understanding swelled in his mind till he wanted to scream. What past did the High Questioner know of? Did he merely hate the son because of the mother?
I am leaving you alone, surrounded by enemies with no protection.
He looked at her, willing himself to speak, though he was sure she could not hear.
I am no longer alone, Mother. I have escaped him.
Stay away from the Ark, Gareth. It will only bring you harm.
There was a last sad smile before the dream faded. Gareth sat up and looked about for his clothes. If this was the kind of comfort the guard had to do without, it hardly seemed worth it. The thought of his mother had become little more than a tormenting sadness. She was gone, and nothing he could do would change the tragedy of her passing. Certainly, this was not a dream to remember, merely a breath from the past, an echo not yet laid to rest. She had been exactly as he had seen her that last time, worn out with the unequal struggle, her decision made. He realized suddenly why the words in the dream had seemed so familiar. She had written them in her letter. Greycast. The first of the 3 rhyme song seasons was half spent. Despite the advance of colder, fouler weather, Erin Inrath still wore its evergreen coat. With no great peaks, and the inland sea washing about its shores, the island never saw anything worse than a nightly frost when the skies were clear, or lashing ice rain on a stormy night. This was a pleasant day, however, with a watery sun promising warmth by mid-morning, and possibly a coatless afternoon. For Karth and 11 others, Hunnick and Rune among them, there was a blazing log fire in the map room, however. The cold had a way of lingering indoors. The men were seated round the map table. An expectant hush had settled over them. Karth nodded in Rune's direction.
Lord Rune, please tell us how you fared in the Southland.
Rune shot him an ugly, resentful look, and was glad to see it had not gone unnoticed. He rose to his feet. His tone was neutral at first, but became more and more deliberate. The impression was created that he was about to unmask some terrible conspiracy.
I traveled south, skirting the Rulam marshes as far as Xerok. The place has been fortified for some unimaginable purpose. It bristles with Southland marsh and desert spears, numbering perhaps 5,000. It is difficult to determine exactly, and there could be many more dug in beneath the soil, as is the marshland custom. They would be hard-pressed to subsist in such a place, though, unless they brought in vast quantities of food and material from elsewhere.
He paused to look at each man in turn.
I doubt whether this is a defensive force. There seems to be little to defend in the southern marshes.
There were smiles all round. He continued.
The warriors I saw were extraordinarily cohesive for such a wide variety of cultures and races. This suggests extraordinarily talented leadership.
Karth watched the performance with increasing annoyance. Had that last remark been aimed at him? Was the man attempting to slight him?
But what was of great interest to me was their constant vigilance, the patrols, the dogs. I had to ask myself why they were on their guard in this place. After all, the greatest threat to their plans of conquest is sitting many miles away on an island in the inland sea.
There were no smiles now. Several of the men glanced nervously at Karth.
Moreover, the pattern of their excursions from the fortress seemed to indicate that they were keeping an eye on developments to the south, facing away from any potential invasion. They were watching the south, the borders of a virtually impenetrable thicket, the Dankwood.
He raised his hands theatrically.
Why?
There was a pause, and Karth could not resist interrupting.
Please, tell us.
The sarcasm was not lost on Rune, but he pretended not to notice.
Something is hidden there. A secret they want to protect, but one that also holds danger for them if it should escape. Millen and I made our way into this dense woodland with much trouble and effort, till we reached the burnt-out area bordered by thorny thickets that had undoubtedly been cultivated there. We reached this place towards evening.
He looked directly at Karth. The old man sensed the moment of crisis had arrived. Whatever had troubled Rune would be brought to light now.
There was something unexpected, something dark and sinister and potent beyond the capabilities of Heron Inrath's so-called army. If I had known such things existed there, I would not have gone within 100 leagues of the Dankwood. I was close enough almost to touch it, and so was Millen, though I doubt whether he would like to recount any part of this adventure. You see, he lost his nerve to such a degree that I had the utmost difficulty in locating him again. I'm sure he would have been back here several days early had I not overtaken him.
All eyes were now fixed on Rune. The faces were set in anticipation. One or two carried a half smile, as if expecting the whole account to be wound up with a clever twist, nothing more than a tall tale for their amusement. Garth was leaning forward, frowning. It was clear that he expected no such ending. Hunnick could contain himself no longer.
Well, what was it?
Rune waited till his next words would have the intended effect.
A dragon.
Men looked at one another in disbelief. Most sat in skeptical silence, amused by this obvious exaggeration. Rune had seen some unknown beast of the south, and mistaken it for a creature of myth. Presently there was a smile or two. Garth, however, sat with a stony expression on his face. So did Hunnick, who was the first to speak.
Fire breather.
Whether it breathes fire or not, I did not wait to find out. From what I could make out, it really had no need of such extravagances. It was highly mobile, winged and agile, all scale and claw, of great bulk and power, and an appetite for flesh.
Voices clamored round him.
This is not possible. It did not attack you?
Garth raised a hand. The men fell silent, one or two still muttering under their breath. Across the table, Rune met his gaze. It was impossible to ignore the challenge in his eyes. Garth kept his tone neutral.
If anyone else had spoken this, I would have doubted it. But I know you are not one to lose your nerve over a trifling threat, nor overstate the events you have witnessed. Besides, I have been concerned about the state of young Millen. He has not breathed a word about this incident, not in idle boast or seeking sensation. In fact, he starts at shadows and wears a pale and somber appearance, something he was not known to abide before.
Rune replied through clenched teeth.
Thank you for the trust. I believed you set little store by my opinion. I was obviously wrong.
Garth swallowed his annoyance and held his peace, but the fingers of his right hand had clenched into a tight fist. If the fellow would only spit it out, what was he so upset about? Rune turned to the others.
Do not question what I saw when you were not there to see it for yourself. Otherwise, call me a liar and be damned. I saw it from but a few paces away, from the side and rear, for it was distracted by some thing or person in a tree opposite the break. I saw it take off and make a grab for this man, and decided not to linger in plain sight when it returned.
Garth had straightened up at this last remark.
You saw a man. Did it take the man?
No. The man fell into the thicket, where he could not be reached. The beast seemed vexed at that.
You could see what type of man it was?
A note of urgency had crept into the old man's voice. Rune shrugged.
No, but he was alone and ragged. I would say a renegade, not part of the grand lot at Xerox.
For a moment Rune's mind went back to the scene he had witnessed. Again he felt the compelling curiosity he had experienced then. He added as an afterthought.
It was not a marsh dweller, or a Southlander. He had fair hair.
A shudder passed through Garth. He looked away. Rune would not let him escape this easily.
But it is not the man that I want to discuss here today. It is the beast. And the fact that this so-called mission had brought me face to face with it. Was that just a miscalculation? Or was it a shot in the dark? A game of chance?
There was a stony silence all round the table. Rune leaned forward, placing his hands on it.
I will not be used as bait to lure some monster from his cage.
Garth had had enough.
No one knew there was such a creature in the Dankwood. What are you trying to say?
What am I trying to say? There will be no more of these tricks. Your traffickers and soothsayers did not know about this danger. What profit, then, to be gained from your precious art, when Malik can keep you blinded at will?
Careful, Lord Rune. Without the art, you are a child groping in the dark. Even if you found something, you wouldn't know what it was.
I wouldn't know. And this from someone who allowed Malik's man to surprise him in his own stronghold.
Garth brought his hand down loudly on the table, Gert remained in trembling restraint, even as he felt the tight reins round his temper snap. The exile had overstepped all bounds.
Will you continue to speak like a fool? You know nothing of Malik, nor the methods he employs. Pass judgment on your own past heroic efforts if you must. At least you are familiar with intoxicating yourself and lying with the whores of a dozen seaside hovels. You believe an endless gutting of worthless swine in the slaughtering pits of Track's Isles has turned you into some great warrior. You grovel in the smut of lesser races, while your heart is a gaping hollow for every foul attribute of Myral's putrid slums. And here you stand to display your great wisdom before me. You are a pitiful son of godlike men, a lost soul, so far adrift that you no longer know what the shore looks like, if ever you did.
A deep silence settled over everyone. Every lost man wished he was somewhere else. Rune was trembling with rage, glaring across the table at his opponent. Karth, his eyes spent for the moment, returned his gaze defiantly. If only this conversation, wild and unrestrained as it had been, had taken place in private, perhaps he would not have lost control. It was little comfort to tell himself that Rune had thrown the first punch, in front of the others, and that there was little he could do after that. The man had walked in there with a confrontation in mind, and nothing would have deterred him. Now his despairing thoughts had been spoken, and the consequences would have to be faced. Slowly the color of anger drained from Rune's temples. He suddenly understood why Karth intimidated him the way he did, why he felt the strong dislike rising in him every time they met. He was afraid of the old man. It was not the fear of physical power or skill, but that of ignorance, measured against such knowledge and understanding as he could never possess. He was indeed a child, groping in the dark, understanding nothing. And his pathetic pride would not have him acknowledge it, here and now, in front of these men. They would despise him for such a show of weakness, the groveling cur, as soon as his master raised his voice. When he spoke, the words were biting and curt.
You are clearly upset. I take my leave till you have been able to digest this dire news.
He turned and walked from the room. Karth sighed and lowered his head. Why was it that the man's irritating manner seemed so familiar to him? Was it that he himself had partaken of these sentiments in the days of his supposed strength? Would it now bring some form of ironic justice to his door? A mocking thought suggested that he was doing well in his attempt at winning over the stubborn Theron exile. Around him other voices rose, offended, indignant. Among them he heard Hanik's comment.
He is like a selfish child, unable to see beyond his own interests.
It was true, of course. Rune no longer had any use for devotion. He had forfeited the blind belief in a good cause long before. Was it even possible to regain such a quality? Karth spoke with a tired voice.
His experience has taught him that everyone is as self-centered as he is. No one but a fool serves blindly. The lowly, dim-witted servant has the welfare of his master at heart, but is never rewarded for such devotion. This Rune is incapable of true service, for he is incapable of love.